To the House. Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. Call the member for Whitsunday.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And of the contributions that I've heard over the last sitting days, I'd have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I do think some members of this House live in a fairyland. When we talk about a cohort of young juvenile repeat offenders, these criminals, and they are criminals, are causing such havoc in community. They have taken people's lives and loved ones. They have brought the fear into people's homes, stolen cars. They have impacted people's businesses every single day. They have impacted people's family lives, and ultimately they have put at risk community safety. And one job a state government has is looking after community and public safety, Madam Deputy Speaker. And when we saw the Premier come out before she took her leave and announced that violent juvenile car thieves will face 14 years jail in a suite of increased penalties aimed squarely at keeping the community safe, and then we see the legislation that we are debating here, it is not even close to what the Premier has committed to the people of Queensland. Once again, the Premier, the ministers bowed to public pressure, to the negative PR and media, and more importantly, from the opposition who had been governing from this side of the House and calling for breach of bail since it was taken away in 2016. And I see members over on the opposite House laughing. I don't think it's funny. I don't think any victim of crime in this state, Madam Deputy Speaker, would think this piece of legislation is funny. Madam Deputy Speaker, in June 2016, Labor scrapped the LNP's breach of bail offence, made childhood findings of guilt inadmissible in court when sentencing a person for an adult offence, reinstated the principle that detention should be the last resort and for the shortest appropriate period when sentencing children. And when we tried to move amendments in this House to ensure that that could be returned into legislation, we were shut down. Reinstated into the Penalties and Sentencing Act the principle that imprisonment is a sentence of last resort and a sentence that allows the offender to stay in the community is preferable. The cohort that we are talking about that come from complex backgrounds, we all agree on that. We all agree on that. But what this Labor government has done over the last several years has actually created the cohort. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I look to my portfolios as a spokesperson for the opposition in the child protection system. Many young people who are in the youth justice system come from the child protection system, a system that is set up to protect children, a system that is failing children in this state. And when you look at the numbers and the correlation of children that come from the child protection system, after the support and intervention by this Labor state government, they are the children who were failed, and they are now the youth repeat offenders that are continuously have been failed. And now they've turned to hardened criminals, Madam Deputy Speaker. Alone in Townsville, and I refer to some crime stats in North Queensland, because the member for Burdick and many members of this side of the House travel to Townsville and Cairns to represent the interests of Queenslanders, and many times we've debated in this House. And in fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, I reflected on Hansard on the 16th of March, which will be 1 year tomorrow, when I stood in this House and represented the good people of Townsville, Thuringowa and Mundingburra, because their own local state members weren't standing up for victims of crime. Their own local state members weren't taking meetings, Madam Deputy Speaker, with their constituents, who were tired, who were scared and who were fed up with the inaction of this state Labor government. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, alone in January in Townsville, we saw 88 cars stolen, in Cairns 73. And the period up until now, till this legislation has been brought to the House, 222 cars stolen in Townsville and 193 in Cairns this year. And today we debate and ask questions of the Premier about what is this government doing for cost of living, and the best the Premier can come up with is we're giving a rebate to your electricity bills. Well, what is the Premier and what are the members from North Queensland doing to alleviate the increased cost of insurance The increase, I'll take that interjection.
Member for Cairns.
I'll take that interjection.
Member for Cairns. Order, members. Order, members.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll take that interjection. The member for Cairns is ignoring me, as he's ignoring his own constituents in Cairns, Madam Deputy Speaker, because those constituents are contacting our Shadow Minister for Police, contacting our Shadow Ministers, because we have been standing up in this House since the election, calling for breach of bail, calling for consequences for action, calling for this government to not go soft on crime, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I look forward, Madam Deputy Speaker, to when we go to Cairns for regional cabinet meeting with the members' constituents. They always provide me with a very warm welcome when I come to Cairns, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've heard many members in this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, talk about the investment into children and youth services, and I would like to reflect on my own community, and that is in Mackay and the Whitsundays years. I met with the Minister for Youth Justice 2 years ago. I have had since representation by the local community to the member for Mackay, Julianne Gilbert. We have not seen an increase in funding in a decade, Madam Deputy Speaker. So for a government that talks about early intervention, supporting young people with complex needs, in my community of Mackay, Isaac and Whitsundays, not one increase in funding in the last decade. But the footprints increased, Madam Deputy Speaker. The department have increased the service agreement with no extra cost. And when my local community are now using reserve funding and making a loss of $60,000 a year to support young people with complex mental health, young people known to child safety, young people known to youth justice, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish that it didn't fall on deaf ears. And it would be fabulous at the end of this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, if my local youth service received some of the funding that I've heard by those opposite Labor members that they receive in their communities, Madam Deputy Speaker. Because clearly, when it comes to making decisions, I hear a lot about evidence-based decisions, but that is certainly not what I see. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to address some comments that were made in regards to victims of crime and what this government is doing when it comes to community safety and, in particular, the cost of living. So insurance prices in my community in Mackay, in Townsville, in Cairns, based on postcode, have gone up in some cases 20 and 30% for car insurance and house insurance. And, Deputy Speaker, what is this government's response? What is the response from the local members? We can't blame the Scott Morrison government anymore. We can't blame Campbell Newman anymore, Mr Deputy Speaker. So my question to the Premier and to those ministers opposite is, what are you doing to support and help the victims of crime before the full force of this legislation is taken into account, of which we know much of it will not work because it was just fluffy announcements? And we've seen evidence by the lack of tracking devices. We've seen evidence by the statistics and numbers of those youth offenders that haven't been detained, that have been released early. Mr Deputy Speaker, those ongoing costs, the fear that's been brought about in our local communities and the lack of response that we see by this government. Mr Deputy Speaker, the LNP will always be tough on crime. The LNP will always hold perpetrators of crime to account. The LNP will also always listen to Queenslanders. We hear them. We understand the challenges that you face. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, if this legislation makes no impact, and if this government is brought back to this House to bring back detention, to remove detention as a last resort, as we've called for, once again we will demonstrate to the people of Queensland that we are governing from opposition.
Call the Minister for Agriculture.